Thank you, Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Wilson, for your submission. I come from an area where is re-wetted. The national parks would have re-wetted a bog. Can you tell me what's the tonnage of carbon sequestered on 1 hectare of re-wetted bog that's approximately re-wetted that's actually the active raised bog habitat in this bog grew by 45% on the studies, even though there was turf being cut on the edge of it, going by the National Parks studies that was done. I want the tonnage, the way that the people would understand the value of the carbon they are sequestering, and probably get nothing for it. You mentioned there, and could you elaborate on it, that the Department of Agriculture in December 2020 have earmarked 30,000 hectares of grassland for re-wetting. And just explain to me, say when a farmer will take Listowel, for example, where there's dairy cows on reclaimed bog and there's grass growing on it. Are you saying to me that that grass isn't sequestering carbon? And are you saying to me that the Department of Agriculture is targeting 30,000 hectares in re-wetting of that type of land? Or maybe I picked you up wrong, but that was the understanding that I had. In the line of the Bornamona bog, would I be correct in saying, because I'd have worked with Ray Flynn, I'm sure you're familiar with them, and Francis Mackin and those in RPS. I'm just wondering, in the works around the country that's been done, they would have looked at, under the Habitats Directive, something that there was degraded bog and there was degraded raised bog. They looked and they stated that you had to sort of look at it inside a 30-year period that should come back to itself, or that to start regenerating. Is that what you're looking at in the Bornamona setup? I would think that it would take longer, because in the bogs that they would have worked on wouldn't be basically the tops weren't taken at them like Bornamona would have done. And it was interesting, and I welcome you stating that basically domestic turf cutters, going by the figures you said there, nominally 400 acres are inconsequential in the whole thing. I welcome that as well. If I could get the answers to those questions, please.
Thank you, Deputy Fitzmaurice, for your questions. In regard to how much carbon will be taken in, well, we know that 6 million tonnes of CO2 is released and drained. So re-wetting, if it's done successfully and is maintained over the year, will shut that down. So we're making avoided losses, or we're savings of 6 million tonnes of CO2. If we can get the plant communities in, and we can maintain the water, we can flip the system so it becomes a sink. And the numbers do vary, so I'm not being vague, but it will depend on the sites. But if we can get a good site that remains wet, then we can certainly look for anything between half a tonne and 1.5 tonnes of carbons. So it's not CO2, it's just carbon per hectare per year, which is not nothing, as I say. So it's a sizable amount. That's initially. Now, if we were moving towards the system where we have recreated the functioning of the peatland so it resembles something like a natural site or an undrained site, that would lower down to something like 0.3 tonnes of CO2 carbon. So initially, when the re-wetting starts, the system becomes very vigorous. There's a lot of carbon goes in, new plants come in. So you're looking at anything between 0.5 to certainly 1.5 tonnes of CO2 carbon, not CO2, CO2 carbon. So multiply that up by 3.66 to get the CO2. So you've made the savings of 6 million tonnes of CO2, and then you have the addition of the sequestration, provided the site remains wet, particularly during the summer months. Your second question was in regard to the Department of Ag. Yeah, they've highlighted or they've identified at least 40,000 hectares of grassland on organic soils. And the point being is, because it's on organic soils, it isn't sequestering carbon, it's releasing carbon. And that's reflected even in our submissions to the National Inventory reporting, 8 million tonnes of CO2 per year. So it's not sequestering carbon. If it was mineral soil, yes, there might be a small amount of carbon sequestered by the mineral soil, the mineral grassland. Your third question was the 30-year time period aboard Namona. Yeah, it's a number that's used to give us the chance to flip the system so that we're not expecting results immediately. Now, what we are finding in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, if re-wetting is done successfully and maintained, the system flips back quite quickly. Now, methane emissions are always an issue in those early years because you've created a situation where you have a lot of organic matter for the microbes to work on. You've re-wetted, there's no oxygen in the system, so you get this flush and spike of methane in the early years. And the thinking, and it is only thinking, that at 30 years, that methane spike will have cleared itself and you're into a system that will be more akin to a natural site where it's taking in a small amount of CO2 every year, it's only releasing a small amount of methane. So 30 years probably reflects that. Nobody really knows. We don't have, that, certainly not in Ireland, we don't have that many long-term re-wetting sites where we can go in and say, this is what's happened in terms of the greenhouse gas dynamics. But 30 years to me sounds reasonable. It's not totally short term. You know, if we're looking very long term, we'd be looking at hundreds of years. But certainly, I would agree with Ray that 30 years is something that we could look at and work with. Now, I would make one point to your last point, I think, where you talk about the turf cutting as being inconsequential. It's inconsequential only because the EPA don't know what's out there. Now, when they get a better handle on what's out there and how much is affected, then that number of 400 hectares will go up, and it could go up by a lot. So it's something that will be dependent on better land use mapping and better use of remote sensing data. So it's not inconsequential, Deputy. Sorry to tell you.
I think it is.
Deputy Carty? Yes. Deputy Carty, in terms of grassland, yes, this is new to us. It's something we haven't engaged in Ireland. The Germans and the Dutch particularly have worked and have been working on it, but they were coming from a different point because their sites were extraordinarily high greenhouse gas emitters because of the amount of nutrients and fertilizer that had gone into those sites before they were re-wetting. So they were very, very high emitters. So there was an impetus on them to re-wet. And the benefits from re-wetting in Germany and the Netherlands was very high because the emissions were so high beforehand.